On All Souls' Night I was awakened at I don't know what time by the double bells. Its monotonous and eternal ringing brought to my mind this tradition that I heard recently in Soria. I tried to sleep again, impossible. Once the imagination is goaded, it is a horse that runs amok and to which it is useless to pull the rein. To pass the time I decided to write it, as indeed I did. I heard it in the same place where it happened, and I have written it sometimes turning my head in fear when I felt the windows on my balcony creak, shivering from the cold night air. Be what you want about it, there it goes, like the Knight of Cups. 1. Tie up the dogs, make the signal with the horns for the hunters to assemble, and let us go around the city. Night is approaching, it is All Saints' Day and we are on the Mount of Souls. As soon to be another day, I will not stop concluding with that flock of wolves that the snows of Moncayo have thrown from their burrows, but today it is impossible. Soon the prayer will sound in the Templars, and the souls of the deceased will begin. A ring his bell in the chapel on the mountain. In that dilapidated chapel. Bah! Do you want to scare me? No, beautiful cousin, you are ignorant of what is happening in this country, because it has not been a year since you came to it from far away. Restrain your mare, I'll also put mine to the walk, and while the road lasts I'll tell you that story. The pages gathered in happy and boisterous groups, the counts of Borges and of Alcudiel mounted their magnificent horses, and all together followed their sons. Beatriz and Alonso, who preceded the procession at a considerable distance. During the journey, Alonso narrated the promised story in these terms: that mountain that today is called de las Animas, belonged to the Templars, whose convent you see there on the bank of the river. The Templars were warriors and religious at the same time. Once Soria was conquered from the Arabs, the king made them come from distant lands to defend the city on the side of the bridge, doing notable harm to his Castilian nobles, who would have known how to defend it as if they were the only ones. They conquered. Between the knights of the new and powerful order and the hidalgos of the city, a deep hatred fermented for some years and finally broke out. The former had delimited that mountain, where they reserved abundant game to satisfy their needs and contribute to their pleasures. The latter decided to organize a great raid on the preserve, despite the severe prohibitions of the clerics with spurs, as they called their enemies. The word of the challenge spread, and nothing was done to stop some in their mania for hunting and others in their determination to hinder him. The proposed expedition was carried out. The beasts did not remember her. Before, so many mothers who dragged mourning for their children would keep it in mind. That was not a hunt, it was a frightful battle. The mountain was strewn with corpses, the wolves whom they wanted to exterminate had a bloody feast. Finally, the king's authority intervened. The mountain, the accursed occasion of so many misfortunes, was declared abandoned, and the religious chapel, located on the same mountain and in whose atrium friends and enemies were buried together, began to fall into ruin. Since then they say that when the night of the dead arrives, the bell of the chapel is heard tolling alone, and that the souls of the dead, wrapped in shreds of their shrouds, run as if on a fantastic hunt through the brush and brambles. The deer bellow in fright, the wolves howl, the snakes give horrifying hisses, and the next day the imprints of the skinless feet of the skeletons have been seen imprinted in the snow. That's why in Soria we call it the Mount of Souls, and that's why I wanted to get out of it before nightfall. Alonso's account ended just as the two young men reached the end of the bridge that leads to the city on that side. There they waited for the rest of the procession, which, after the two riders joined them, got lost among the narrow and dark streets of Soria. 2. The servers had just cleared the tablecloths. The high Gothic chimney of the palace of the Counts of Alcudiel emitted a bright glow, illuminating groups of ladies and gentlemen who were conversing familiarly around the fire, and the wind whipped the leaded windows of the hall's warheads. Only two people seemed oblivious to the general conversation, Beatriz and Alonso. Beatriz followed with her eyes, absorbed in a vague thought, the whims of the flame. Alonso watched the reflection of the bonfire sparkle in Beatriz's blue pupils. Both save a deep silence not so many time ago. About the night of the dead, the duennas recounted fearful tales, in which the specters and apparitions played the main role, and the bells of the churches of Soria tolled in the distance with a sad, monotonous peal. "Beautiful cousin," exclaimed Alonso at last, breaking the long silence in which they found themselves, "soon we are going to separate, perhaps forever. I know you don't like the arid plains of Castilla, their rough and warlike customs, their simple and patriarchal habits. I have heard you sigh several times, perhaps because of some gallant from your distant lordship." Beatriz made a gesture of cold indifference. The whole character of a woman was revealed in that contemptuous contraction of her thin lips. "Perhaps because of the pomp of the French court, where you have lived up to now," the young man hastened to add. "In one way or another, I have a feeling that I will soon lose you. When we part, I would like you to carry a memory of me. Do you remember when we went to the temple to give thanks to God for having given you back the health that you came to? I searched this land. The jewel that held the feather of my cap captivated your attention. How beautiful it would be holding a veil over your dark hair. It has already turned on that of a bride. My father gave it to the one who gave me birth, and she took it to the altar. Do you want it?" "I don't know about yours," answered the beauty, "but in my country a pledge received compromises a will. Only on a day of ceremony should a present be accepted from a relative, who can still go to Rome without returning empty-handed." The icy accent with which Beatriz pronounced these words disturbed the young man for a moment, who after calming down said sadly, "I know, cousin, but today all saints are celebrated, and yours among all. Today is the day of ceremonies and presents. Do you want to accept mine?" Beatriz slightly bit her lip, and reached out to take the jewel, without adding a word. The two young men remained silent again, and the cracked voice of the old women who spoke of witches and goblins was heard again, and the hum of the air that made the glass of the warheads creak, and the sad and monotonous tolling of the bells. After a few minutes, the interrupted dialogue resumed as follows. "And before the end of All Saints' Day, when mine is celebrated just like yours, and you can, without tying your will, leave me a souvenir, won't you?" he said, fixing a look on his cousins, which flashed like lightning, illuminated by a devilish thought. "Why not?" she exclaimed, placing her hand on her right shoulder as if to search for something among the folds of her wide gold-embroidered velvet sleeve. Then, with a childish expression of sentiment, she added, "Do you remember the blue sash that I wore to the hunt today, and that for I don't know what emblem of its color you told me was the emblem of your soul?" "Yeah. Well, it's lost. It has been lost, and I was thinking of leaving it as a souvenir." "Has been lost? And where?" Alonso asked, getting up from his seat, and with an indescribable expression of fear and hope. "I don't know, in the mountains perhaps." "On the Mount of the Souls," he murmured, turning pale and letting himself fall on the seat, "on the Mount of Souls." Then he continued in a broken and muffled voice. "You know it, because you will have heard it 1,000 times, in the city, throughout Castilla, they call me the King of Hunters. Not having yet been able to prove my strength in combat, like my ancestors, I have brought to that diversion, the image of war, all the spirit of my youth, all the ardor hereditary in my race. The carpet that your feet walk on are the remains of beasts that I have dyed by my hand. I know their haunts and their customs, I have fought with them day and night, on foot and on horseback, alone and in raids, and no one will say that they have seen me flee danger on any occasion. Another night I would fly through that band, and I would fly joyful as if to a party, and yet, tonight, why hide it from you? I'm afraid. Do you hear? The bells toll, the prayer has sounded in San Juan del Duero, the souls of the mountain will now begin to raise their yellowish skulls from among the weeds that cover their graves, the souls. The mere sight of which can chill the blood of the bravest with horror, turn his hair white, or carry him away in the whirlwind of his fantastic career like a leaf that is blown by the wind from nowhere. As the young man spoke, an imperceptible smile appeared on Beatrice's lips, and when he had finished, she exclaimed in an indifferent tone, and while she stirred up the fire in the hearth, where the wood jumped and crackled, throwing sparks of 1,000 colors. Oh! That in no way. What madness! Now go to the mountains for such a trifle. Such a dark night, the night of the dead, and the road full of wolves. When saying this last sentence, he recharged it in such a special way that Alonso could not help but understand all his bitter irony. Moved as if by a spring, he stood up, passed his hand over his forehead, as if to tear away the fear that was in his face. Head, and not in his heart, and with a firm voice he exclaimed, addressing the beautiful one, who was still bent over the hearth, amusing herself by stirring the fire. Goodbye, Beatrice, goodbye. See you soon. Alonso. Alonso, said the latter, turning quickly, but when he wanted or pretended to want to stop him, the young man had disappeared. A few minutes later the sound of a horse galloping away was heard. The beauty, with a radiant expression of satisfied pride that colored her cheeks, paid an attentive ear to that rumor, which was weakening, which was lost, which finally vanished. The old women, meanwhile, continued in their tales of ghosts, the air hummed in the windows of the balcony, and the bells of the city tolled in the distance. 2. An hour had passed, 2, 3, midnight was about to strike, and Beatrice retired to her oratory. Alonso did not return, he did not return, when in less than an hour he could have done so. He must have been afraid, exclaimed the young woman, closing her prayer book and heading towards her bed, after having tried in vain to murmur some of the prayers that the Church consecrates on the Day of the Dead to those who no longer exist. After putting out the lamp and crossing the double silk curtains, he fell asleep with a restless, light, nervous sleep. The Postigo clock struck 12. Between her dreams, Beatrice heard the vibrations of the campaign, slow, muffled, extremely sad, and she half opened her eyes. He thought he had heard a couple of them pronounce his name, but far, far away, and by a muffled and mournful voice. The wind moaned in the window panes. It must be the wind, he said, and placing her hand over her heart, she tried to calm herself. But his heart was beating with increasing violence. The large doors of the oratory had creaked on their hinges with a long, shrill, high-pitched shriek. First some, and then the others closer, all the doors that gave way to his room were ringing by his order, these with a deaf and serious noise, those with a long and nerve-wracking lament. Then silence, a silence full of strange sounds, the silence of midnight, with a monotonous murmur of distant water, distant barking of dogs, confused voices, unintelligible words, echoes of footsteps coming and going, rustling of dragging clothes. Sighs that are drowned, labored breaths that are almost felt, involuntary shudders that announce the presence of something that is not seen, and whose approach is nevertheless noticeable in the dark. Beatrice, motionless, trembling, put her head out of the curtains and listened for a moment. He heard 1,000 different noises. He passed his hand over his forehead, listened again, nothing, silence. I saw with that phosphorescence of the pupil in nervous breakdowns, like lumps that moved in all directions, and when expanding them he fixed them at a point, nothing, darkness, impenetrable shadows. Whoa! She exclaimed, returning to rest her beautiful head on the blue satin pillow of the bed. Am I as fearful as these poor people, whose hearts beat with terror under their armor, when they hear a ghost's advice? And closing her eyes she tried to sleep, but in vain. She had made an effort on herself. Soon she rose up again, paler, more restless, more terrified. It was no longer an illusion. The brocade door hangings had rubbed apart, and slow footsteps sounded on the carpet. The sound of those footsteps was muffled, almost imperceptible, but continuous, and at the same time something like wood or bone could be heard creaking. And they came closer, and the prie-dieu that was. The edge of his bed. Beatrice uttered a sharp cry, and wrapping herself in the clothes that covered her, she hid her head and held her breath. The air whipped the windows of the balcony, the water from the distant source fell with an eternal and monotonous rumor. The barking of the dogs expanded in the gusts of the air, and the bells of the city of Soria, some close, others distant, tolled sadly for the souls of the deceased. Thus passed an hour, 2, the night, a century, because that night seemed eternal. Beatrice. At last the dawn broke. Recovered from his fear, he half opened his eyes to the first rays of light. After a sleepless night and terrors, the clear white light of day is so beautiful. She parted the silk curtains of the bed, and was already preparing to laugh at her past fears, when suddenly a cold sweat covered her body, her eyes widened, and a deathly pallor discolored her cheeks. On the prie-dieu he had seen bloody and torn the blue band that he had lost in the mountains, the blue band that Alonso had gone to look for. When her terrified servants arrived to notify her of the death of Alcutiel's eldest son, who had appeared that morning devoured by wolves in the undergrowth of Monte de los Animas, they found her motionless, tense, clinging with both hands to one of the ebony columns. From the bed, her eyes wide open, her mouth ajar, her lips white, her limbs rigid, dead, scared to death. 4. They say that after this event occurred, a lost hunter who spent the night of the dead without being able to leave the Mount of Souls, and who the next day, before dying, was able to recount what he saw, reported horrible things. Among others, it is assured that he saw the skeletons of the ancient Templars and the nobles of Soria buried in the atrium of the chapel, rise at the point of prayer with a horrible noise, and knights on the bones of steeds, chasing like there was a beautiful woman, pale and disheveled, who with bare and bloody feet, and uttering screams of horror, was walking around Alonso's tomb.